The blockade of Mariupol will go down in history of responsibility for war crimes.
I think he is a war criminal.
President Biden and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky have called Russian President Vladimir Putin a war criminal and claim that Russia's actions in Ukraine are war crimes. At the end of February, the International Criminal Court announced that it's investigating possible war crimes during the war in Ukraine.
War crimes and crimes against humanity are crimes that are prosecuted against individuals. So it is not a prosecution of a state or a group or a particular army. So if Zelensky or Biden call these war crimes and label certain people like Putin to be war criminals, that is completely understandable based on the evidence that exists. That is not a judgment that has been made in a court of law.
There are different kinds of war crimes, and they all require thorough investigation and evidence to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt.
Targeting civilians intentionally during an armed conflict is a war crime. Abusing prisoners that are captured during an armed conflict is also a war crime.
And similarly, it's illegal under international humanitarian law, the laws of war, to direct attacks against civilian objects. So houses, hospitals, museums, structures that civilians use in their daily life are supposed to be spared the damage caused by war.
Certain rules apply during war, and intentional violations of those rules can be prosecuted as war crimes.
On March 23rd, the U.S. State Department announced Russia had committed war crimes in Ukraine.
The war crimes investigations that are being conducted by the International Criminal Court are of course, a separate judicial matter, and nobody will be convicted or punished as a war criminal until evidence is brought and there's a trial.
But the U.S. is separate from the ICC, and it does not recognize its authority. They could, however, assist in the prosecution before the court. Mariner also points out the limitations in prosecuting world leaders, or even soldiers, with war crimes.
You have to understand a lot about the context of a situation. You have to know, for example, were there members of the Ukrainian military or of Ukrainian paramilitary forces in those hospitals, in those schools? So, the videos don't speak for themselves.
And Whitting notes that investigations are not one-sided.
The International Criminal Court always opens investigations saying that it will investigate any allegations of crimes committed on either side of a conflict. So if crimes are committed by Ukrainian forces, those will also be investigated.
But the investigation of war crimes can take years, even decades, and the prosecution can be even more complicated, especially considering that the ICC does not have jurisdiction in Russia.
Ukraine has given the court jurisdiction, and the alleged crimes are being committed on the territory of Ukraine. However, if the court were to develop sufficient evidence to charge any Russian combatants, soldiers, political leaders, or Putin himself, the challenge would be how to arrest them. So an arrest would only occur if an individual who is charged traveled outside of Russia to a state party that would arrest that person, or if the government at some point changed in Russia and the new government surrendered anybody who was charged with war crimes or crimes against humanity to the International Criminal Court.
Putin's recent actions echo past military operations.
What we're seeing in Ukraine, I think, is consistent with what we previously saw in Syria and even before that in Chechnya. It's a pattern of indiscriminate attacks, a pattern of destruction of civilian objects and killing of civilians. And I do believe that, the lack of punishment for all the crimes that Russian forces committed is directly a causal factor in the continuing war crimes that we're seeing in Ukraine.
It has emboldened Putin and Russian forces to use the same playbook, commit the same kinds of offenses in this conflict. And so the cost of not holding attacking forces or militaries to account, to hold them responsible, is that it allows the crimes to occur again in the future.